At the end of the Second World War, there was a series of executions that took place inside of Hamelin prison, in which some of the most brutal guards who worked within the concentration camp system were sent crashing through the gallows. The guards of Bergen-Belsen were known for their terrible crimes, and at the end of the war, the Allies liberated the site, which they described as hell on earth. Men such as Josef Kramer, the commandant of the camp, and Dr. Fritz Klein were executed together on the gallows, stood side by side, but there were a number of women, including Irma Grese, who were executed first, and they plunged through the trapdoor on their own. The man who carried out those executions was experienced British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, and he expertly took the lives of those war criminals with efficiency but ruthlessness. But this would have been disturbing for those who witnessed the executions still. But why? Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp was one of the worst sights of horror of the Second World War. It had opened as a prisoner of war camp in 1943, but became a full concentration camp later. It was intended to be a place where prisoners were exchanged for German prisoners of war, but as the conflict rolled on, it became a site where thousands and thousands died. As the Second World War was turning against the Germans, other camps such as Auschwitz were evacuated, and thousands of prisoners were sent to other sites on death marches. In December 1944, Josef Kramer became the commandant, and he had previously been the man in charge of the execution site of Auschwitz II-Birkenau. Kramer was a ruthless man who put the people in the camp to death, and he did nothing to improve the conditions. As more people arrived at Belsen, conditions broke down. By April 1945, 60,000 people were within the walls, with Belsen a site which was originally built for around 10,000. There was nowhere to sleep, there was no food, sanitation and cleanliness was non-existent, and diseases ran rampant around Belsen. There was no gas chamber at the camp, but diseases spread by the conditions of the site, which was the biggest killer. In March 1945, at least 18,000 people died in just 1 month alone. The guards were known for keeping prisoners within this state, and they were known for their violence too. Women such as Irma Grese shot those who were not performing any work, or who broke the camp rules, trying to get any morsel or scrap of food. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 after Heinrich Himmler agreed to have the camp surrendered to the Allies without a fight. A number of SS guards, including the Commandant, Kramer, remained to allegedly maintain law and order at the site, but when the British and Canadian troops entered Bergen-Belsen, they were greeted with a terrible scene. Found over the camp were 13,000 unburied corpses and around 60,000 people who were dying. Most were sick with disease and all of them were starving, as prisoners had been without food or water for days. At this time, 500 people a day were succumbing to their deaths. One British reporter who was part of the liberation claimed that, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies had been born here, tiny things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust the tiny mite into his arms, then ran off crying terribly." The British arrested many of the SS guards who were attempting to hide out, and they were then ordered to help clean up the bodies. And large mass graves were dug, and the bodies were then placed inside of them. Some of the guards actually contracted typhus from the corpses, but at the end of the clean-up, a number of them remained inside of British custody. The Belsen trials took place in 1945, and the defendants, including female guards as well as male guards, were brought to the courtroom to answer for their crimes. It was clear what they had done. There were 45 former SS men, women and Carpos, prisoner functionaries, on trial, and the most senior was the Commandant Josef Kramer. The defendants also included Irma Grese, Herta Bofa and other female guards, such as Elisabeth Falkenrath. The charges saw the defendants accused of crimes at Belsen and also Auschwitz, and what usually sent someone through the gallows was the crimes they committed at Auschwitz too, this being a determining condition. The trial lasted 54 days in court, and at the end there were a number of death sentences handed out. Condemned to death was Josef Kramer, Fritz Klein, Peter Weingartner, Franz Hörsler, Karl Franchot, Ansgar Pieschen, Franz Stoeffel, Wilhelm Dorr, and female guards Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann. The condemned were transferred to Hamelin prison for their executions, and inside of a room, gallows were constructed, and this was then converted into an execution chamber. As the British sentenced these men and women to death, it was a British executioner who performed the job, Albert Pierrepoint, who usually worked back home as a hangman, and he was brought across the Channel to Germany to execute the Belsen defendants. Pierrepoint usually utilised the long drop, and he was an expert in this method, with the height and weight of the condemned recorded before the execution, and then Pierrepoint calculated the drop required to snap the neck. This was quick and usually brought death instantaneously. Pierrepoint was known for his skill with this method. In the early hours of the 13th of December 1945, the defendants were all locked up in individual cells and chambers at the end of the corridor, where the execution chamber stood. Pierrepoint had met with all of them before to record their height and weight, and he knew the exact drops needed to bring death quickly. He repeated a similar process throughout. Along with his assistant, they collected a condemned person, then took them into the chamber and sent them crashing through the gallows. Now the women were executed first, and also on their own, but the men were executed simultaneously in pairs, stood next to each other on the platform to make the proceedings quicker. Inside the execution chamber was a number of officials or witnesses who were stood by to ensure that the executions went by smoothly. For those who witnessed the executions, they would see the precise yet ruthless nature of long drop hanging, but they also heard things that they would never forget. Pierrepoint wrote of Irma Grese's execution that, "The following morning we climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung open the door, and we filed past the row into the execution chamber. The officers stood to attention, and I walked into the corridor and called Irma Grese. The guards quickly closed the grille on all 12 of the inspection holes and opened the door. Irma Grese stepped out. The cell was too small for me to go inside, and then she followed the executioner out of the cell. She was led up to the gallows at around 9:34 a.m, and then was shuffled over the chalk X that had been made on the floor. A white cap was placed over her head, and she shouted 'Schnell' before plunging to her death, with the doctor pronouncing her dead instantly. Now the process was repeated for the women as mentioned, and then the men were executed together in pairs. There was more that could go wrong with this, but there were enough British guards around to ensure that the men went to their deaths quickly. One of the worst things that would have haunted those inside the execution chamber was the sound of the snap brought about as the condemned passed through the gallows. This was an audible crack and the snap of the neck, which would have been heard. Also, the quickness of the executions meant that things were very rapid. There was hardly a breath for Pierrepoint as he prepared the next person for execution after sending one person through the gallows. Usually a doctor within 10 minutes of the drop being released confirmed that death had occurred, and the bodies were then cut down and then placed inside of coffins. It took Pierrepoint just a matter of hours to execute the defendants of the Belsen trials, and nothing really went wrong. But the terror of the executions was that it was quick and rapid. The curtain of the gallows covered the aftermath, and placing those inside of the coffin, but it was most definitely a rather brutal set of executions, especially with the snap of the neck. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.